A bear walks into the emergency room. What it's carrying leaves everyone in shock. Claire Donovan had worked night shifts at St. Mary's Hospital in Chicago for years, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for what stormed through the emergency doors that night. The cold autumn rain pounded against the glass, and the scent of antiseptic filled the air as the beeping of heart monitors and the occasional murmur of doctors dictated the hospital's late-hour rhythm. She was finishing up notes on a patient's chart when the automatic doors slid open, accompanied by a burst of frigid wind. At first, she barely glanced up, assuming it was just another late-night emergency case. Then the room fell silent. Silence in an ER was unnatural, impossible. Claire turned her head and felt her breath hitch in her throat. A massive bear, its hulking form dripping rainwater onto the tile floor, had stepped inside. Its fur was dark with dampness, and its amber eyes gleamed beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. The beast's every breath sent small puffs of vapor into the air. But what truly sent Claire's mind reeling was what the bear carried. Draped across its back was a creature unlike anything she had ever seen. It looked both feline and reptilian, with sleek, spotted fur covering its torso, but shimmering scales running along its limbs. A long tail curled limply at its side, its golden eyes barely open, revealing vertical pupils that flickered weakly before closing again. The bear shifted, lowering itself onto its front legs, as if carefully presenting the unconscious creature to them. Someone gasped behind her. A tray clattered to the floor. A security guard reached for his radio. The whole world seemed to tilt on its axis. Claire's heart pounded in her ears, but her feet were already moving. Before she could think about what she was doing, she stepped forward. The bear huffed, its breath warm despite the cold outside, but it didn't move to stop her. Up close, the hybrid creature's condition became more evident. Its fur was matted with something thick and dark, its breathing shallow and strained. Claire dropped to one knee, slowly extending a hand toward its scaled forelimb. Warm, alive. "We need a stretcher," she called out, her voice steady despite the chaos crackling around her. Nobody moved. The security guard's voice trembled as he spoke into his radio, calling for backup. A few nurses edged backward. Even the attending physician stood frozen in the doorway of Trauma Room 1, his face a mixture of fear and disbelief. Claire gritted her teeth, pushing down her own rising panic. The creature, whatever it was dying. If no one else was going to act, then she would. "Now!" she snapped, and that was enough to kick a few people into motion. Two orderlies hesitated before finally wheeling over a stretcher. Claire moved with precise efficiency, slipping her arms beneath the creature's torso, careful of its injuries. The moment her hands made contact, a strange pulse thrummed through her fingertips, a sensation like static electricity, but warmer. The bear let out a deep, guttural sound, not quite a growl, not quite a sigh, before stepping back, its job seemingly done. The moment the creature was on the stretcher, the bear turned. With one last glance at Claire, it lumbered toward the still open doors, stepping back into the storm without hesitation. The doors hissed shut, leaving only the sound of distant thunder and Claire's own unsteady breathing. "Get me vitals," she ordered as she wheeled the stretcher toward the trauma bay. The creature's fur was damp beneath her gloves, its chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. "I need a full workup. Heart rate, BP, oxygen levels." A nurse hesitated before reaching for the pulse oximeter. I don't know where to." Claire clenched her jaw. She had to think. The creature was not human, but its anatomy bore familiar elements. She pressed two fingers against its neck, searching. A pulse, weak but present. She turned to the nurse. "Here, on the side of the neck. Place the monitor there." The numbers flickered to life. Heart rate erratic, oxygen levels dangerously low. The physician, who had hesitated before finally stepped forward, snapping into professional mode. "What the hell are we dealing with, Donovan?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but it's dying. So we do what we always do. We save it." The room burst into action. 4 lines were started. Oxygen was administered. An ultrasound probe skimmed over the creature's chest, revealing an internal structure, both eerily human and distinctly alien. Claire worked with the precision of someone on autopilot, but her mind raced. Where had this thing come from? And why did she have the strangest sense that she was supposed to be here, right now, in this exact moment. Then the siren started, not the hospital alarm, not an ambulance. These were external, coming from outside. Red and blue lights slashed through the storm, the unmistakable sign of government vehicles pulling into the lot. Claire's stomach twisted. A new voice cut through the noise, cold and commanding. "Step away from the specimen." She turned, her hands still pressed against the creature's side. A group of men in tactical gear stood in the doorway. They weren't police. Their uniforms bore no insignias. Their faces were unreadable behind dark visors. The leader, a man with iron gray hair and sharp eyes, took a step forward. "This facility is now under federal jurisdiction. Hand over the creature." Claire's breath hitched. The order was simple, clear: obey, and she could walk away unscathed. But then the creature on the stretcher shuddered beneath her touch, its golden eyes flickering open, locking onto hers with something raw, something pleading. She knew that look. She had seen it before, years ago, on the face of her brother when they were kids, when he had fallen from a tree and broken his arm, reaching for her, trusting her. Ethan. The name surged through her like lightning. Impossible. He was dead. He had been dead for 3 years. But the look in this creature's eyes told her otherwise. The agents moved closer. Claire made her choice. Her fingers curled around the metal railing of the stretcher, and with a sharp breath, she yanked it backward, pivoting on her heel. Then she ran. The moment Claire's feet hit the linoleum, everything became a blur of motion. Behind her, shouts erupted as the agents lunged forward, but she had a head start, and she wasn't about to waste it. The stretcher rattled as she pushed it through the hallway, her hands gripping the metal frame with all the strength she had. Nurses and doctors gasped and leapt out of the way as she careened past, ignoring the calls of "Claire, what are you doing?" and "Stop her." She had no time to explain, no time to second-guess the madness of what she was doing. The creature, Noah, her mind supplied, as if the name had always been there, groaned softly, its golden eyes flickering in and out of focus as she wheeled it down the dimly lit corridor toward the one place she knew they wouldn't follow. The basement. Her heart pounded as she reached the stairwell at the far end of the hallway. The elevator was too risky, too slow, too predictable. She slammed the stretcher to a stop, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and yanked open the stairwell door. No time to hesitate. Noah was too weak to walk, and she had no idea how much longer it would last in its condition. The distant pounding of boots on the tile floors spurred her forward. With one last inhale, she leaned down, grasped Noah's limp body, and lifted. It was lighter than she expected, its sleek form deceptively delicate despite its size. She gritted her teeth and half-carried, half-dragged it through the doorway, letting the heavy door swing shut behind her. The stairwell was cold, the kind of industrial, fluorescent-lit emptiness that made everything feel surreal. The pounding of boots above grew louder. They were close. Claire didn't stop to think. She moved, her body fueled by something beyond adrenaline, beyond fear. She stumbled down the first flight of stairs, Noah's body slack in her grasp. The creature let out a weak sound, something that was neither a growl nor a whimper, but held an unmistakable meaning. It was trusting her. It had no choice. She reached the bottom of the stairs just as the agents burst into the hallway above. Their voices echoed down the stairwell. "She's in the basement! Move! Move!" But Claire had already shoved open the metal door and disappeared into the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the hospital. The basement was a relic of another era, a forgotten maze of storage rooms, old equipment, and winding passageways that most of the hospital staff barely remembered existed. Her shoes slapped against the concrete floor as she ran, gasping for breath, searching. There was a door here, somewhere, a door that didn't belong. She knew it. She had seen it once, years ago, when she had wandered too far while searching for a missing supply cart. A door with no handle, no keycard slot, just smooth metal embedded into the farthest wall of the basement. She hadn't questioned it then. Now, it was her only hope. Noah stirred against her, its body pressing weakly into her side. She tightened her grip and rounded a corner, her eyes scanning the dim hallway frantically. There, the door loomed ahead, blending so perfectly into the concrete wall that she might have missed it if she hadn't known what to look for. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second before pressing her palm flat against the cold metal. Nothing. Panic flared in her chest. She tried again, this time slamming her fist against it. Still nothing. The agents were getting closer. She could hear them now, their footsteps echoing through the tunnels. Claire swallowed hard. Think. Think. Noah stirred, lifting its head slightly, its golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. It turned its gaze toward the door, then back to her, as if urging her to try again. She pressed her palm to the metal once more, willing something, anything to happen. This time the door hissed. A seam appeared in the wall, splitting down the center. With a soft rush of air, the door slid open. Claire had no time to process the how or why. She just surged forward, pulling Noah with her. The moment they crossed the threshold, the door sealed shut behind them, plunging them into silence. The space before her was vast, unexpected, a hidden lab. Ethan's lab. Rows of sleek monitors lined the walls, flickering to life as they registered her presence. Strange, fluid-filled tanks stood in the corners, their contents obscured by frost on the glass. A massive console dominated the far end of the room, glowing softly with symbols she didn't recognize. The air was different here, charged, alive. Claire's breath came fast, her mind racing. This was impossible. How long had this place been here? How had Ethan hidden it beneath the hospital? A soft chime echoed through the room, and then his voice. Claire. She froze. The voice wasn't coming from the speakers. It wasn't a recording. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned, and there he was. Ethan. Not a memory, not a projection. Ethan standing before her, very much alive. His dark hair was longer than she remembered, his face gaunter, but his eyes, those sharp, restless eyes that had always been too full of ideas, were unmistakably his. She couldn't breathe. You're not real, she whispered, her voice barely audible. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. I am, and we don't have much time. Noah let out a soft, almost relieved sound and slumped against the floor, its body too exhausted to hold itself up any longer. Claire stared at Ethan, the thousand questions in her mind colliding into chaos. You're supposed to be dead, she choked out. His expression darkened, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. I know. He took a step forward, stopping just short of her. Claire, listen to me. What you just did, bringing Noah here, that was the right choice, but it also means they won't stop coming. Her chest tightened. What is it? Ethan exhaled slowly. It's proof that everything we know about evolution is wrong. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She glanced at Noah, at its strange hybrid body, at the intelligence lurking behind its exhausted eyes. Then back at her brother, whose presence alone defied everything she thought she knew. The world tilted on its axis. Outside the sealed door, the agents would be searching, closing in. But Claire had already crossed the threshold into something much bigger than herself. And there was no turning back now. Claire's mind felt like it was struggling to keep up with reality, spinning between shock, disbelief, and something dangerously close to hope. Ethan was standing right in front of her, solid and real, his voice not a ghostly echo from the past, but a tangible presence in the dimly lit lab. Her hands shook as she took a step forward, part of her wanting to touch him just to confirm he wasn't an illusion, but the other part, trained by years of grief, held back, wary of believing in something impossible. Behind her, Noah let out a weak exhale, its body slumped against the sleek metal floor, its golden eyes fluttering shut as if now that it had reached this place, it no longer had to fight to stay awake. Claire swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing, but it was impossible when Ethan was looking at her with that same intense, restless expression she had memorized as a child. The expression of a mind always running ahead, always searching for something just beyond reach. Say something, she finally managed, her voice hoarse, because right now, I'm thinking you're either a hallucination or a really bad joke. Ethan's lips twitched, but there was no humor in his gaze. I wish I had time for explanations, but we don't. He turned, striding toward one of the consoles, his fingers moving across a holographic interface with a speed that told her he had been here for a long time. They'll be scanning for energy signatures. This lab is shielded, but only for so long. If we don't act now, they'll find us. Claire's feet remained rooted to the floor, her mind still trying to bridge the gap between the brother she had mourned and the man standing before her now. You disappeared 3 years ago. The search team found nothing. They said there was no chance you survived. Her voice cracked despite herself. And now you expect me to just accept that you're alive and running a secret lab under a hospital? Ethan paused, exhaling sharply. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. I didn't expect you to find out like this. She let out a short, bitter laugh. Oh, really? What was the plan? Let me think you were dead forever? His jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Guilt. He looked away, hands pressing flat against the console. It was safer that way. Claire took a slow step forward, heat rising in her chest. For who? He didn't answer immediately, but the tension in his shoulders said enough. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of machines and the distant pounding of her own heartbeat. Then softly he said, "For you." The words hit like a blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. She wanted to argue, to demand why, but before she could, the console let out a sharp, warning beep. Ethan cursed under his breath, fingers moving rapidly over the glowing interface. They're deploying drones. We need to move. Claire's hands clenched into fists. Her mind screamed for answers, but her instincts, the ones honed in the chaos of the ER, in the moments where action had to come before understanding, took over. She turned to Noah, who was still weak but conscious, and crouched beside it, pressing a gentle hand against its side. Can you stand? The creature blinked up at her, then shifted, muscles tensing as it struggled onto unsteady limbs. Its tail curled slightly for balance, its scaled limbs trembling, but it managed to rise. Claire gave it an encouraging nod before turning back to Ethan. Where are we going? Ethan was already moving toward the far end of the lab, where a wall panel slid open to reveal a narrow, dimly lit tunnel. There's an exit beneath the old subway lines. It leads to a sector outside their surveillance grid. If we make it there, we can regroup. Claire glanced at the lab around her, at the sleek, advanced technology embedded in the walls, at the strange, fluid-filled tanks that held things she didn't have time to process. What is all this? Ethan didn't look back. The future. She didn't have time to press him. The sound of static interference crackled through unseen speakers, and then a voice, cold, controlled, unmistakably inhuman in its precision, echoed through the lab. Dr. Donovan, you have violated containment protocols. Surrender immediately. Claire's blood turned to ice. Ethan grabbed her wrist, pulling her into motion. Run! They bolted through the tunnel, Noah keeping pace beside them despite its weakened state. The air was damp and stale, thick with the scent of old metal and forgotten places. The walls narrowed as they ran, the passage sloping downward, the faint vibrations of the city above rumbling through the ground beneath their feet. Claire's lungs burned, her heart pounding against her ribs, but she didn't dare slow down. A distant explosion shook the tunnel. She risked a glance over her shoulder. A section of the lab had erupted in fire and smoke, but through the haze, dark figures were emerging, figures that moved too smoothly, too perfectly to be human. I see them. His grip tightened on her wrist. Faster. The tunnel veered sharply to the right, and suddenly they were no longer running through sterile steel corridors, but through something older, something forgotten. The walls were crumbling brick, the air thick with dust. Pipes ran along the ceiling, leaking moisture onto the ground. It looked like an abandoned maintenance tunnel, but there was a distinct sense of purpose in the way Ethan navigated the twists and turns. He had been here before. Behind them, the pursuit didn't slow. A mechanical voice echoed through the tunnel, closer now. Resistance is futile. You cannot escape. Claire grit her teeth. Who the hell are these guys? Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he yanked her into a side passage so abruptly she nearly lost her footing. Noah followed, its golden eyes flickering, with something dangerously close to fear. A heavy metal door loomed ahead. Ethan slammed his palm against a sensor, and the door slid open just as something metallic and fast-moving lunged toward them. Claire caught a glimpse. Sleek, humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs too segmented, its eyes nothing but glowing blue voids. Before Ethan shoved her through the doorway, the door slammed shut behind them. The air was suddenly colder, the silence deafening. Claire doubled over, gasping for breath. Noah pressed close to her side, trembling. Ethan leaned against the wall, his face pale in the dim light. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then finally, Claire straightened, turning to her brother with fire in her veins. "You are going to tell me everything. Now." Ethan wiped a hand down his face, exhaling slowly. And then, he did. Claire's breath was still ragged, her pulse pounding in her ears as she leaned against the cold concrete wall, trying to process the fact that she had just barely escaped whatever those things were. Her entire body ached from running, from fear, from the weight of 1,000 questions crushing down on her. But none of it mattered because Ethan was standing there, alive, watching her with the same intensity he always had when he was about to explain something insane. Noah was curled beside her, its golden eyes half-lidded, its chest rising and falling in shallow but steady breaths, its tail twitching with unease. The air was damp, the walls around them old and cracked, lined with rusted pipes that dripped water onto the uneven floor. But none of it distracted Claire from the fact that she was waiting for answers. Real ones this time. No half-truths, no evasion, no cryptic warnings. Ethan ran a hand through his unkempt hair, exhaling sharply before meeting her gaze. "You need to understand something before I start," he said, his voice low, steady, like he was carefully choosing each word before he spoke it. "What I was working on, what I found, it wasn't supposed to be possible." Claire narrowed her eyes. "Yeah? Well, neither was you coming back from the dead, but here we are." His lips pressed into a thin line, but he nodded. "Fair enough." He glanced toward the heavy metal door they had just sealed behind them, then back at her. 3 years ago, when my team and I went into the Amazon, we weren't just studying the rainforest, we were tracking something old, something that wasn't supposed to exist outside of theory. Claire folded her arms, forcing herself to stay still, even as every instinct told her she wasn't going to like where this was going. "Something like Noah?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but Noah isn't the first." A chill ran down Claire's spine, but she didn't move. "Explain." Ethan let out a slow breath, pacing slightly as if the motion helped him untangle the words in his head. "We've always thought of evolution as slow, random, shaped by millions of years of environmental pressures. But what if it wasn't? What if there was something else, a force, a process that could guide evolution directly, deliberately?" Claire shook her head. "That's not how it works, Ethan." He gave her a sharp look. "I know that's what we were taught, but it's wrong. We found evidence in the Amazon, organisms that were adapting at an impossible rate, changing in response to their environment in ways that should have taken millennia, but were happening in real time. Plants, animals, things we didn't have names for. And at the center of it all, we found something buried deep beneath the forest floor. Something ancient, a catalyst." She frowned. "A catalyst for what?" Ethan's expression darkened. "For directed evolution." The words sent another shiver through her. "That's..." She struggled for the right words. "You're saying something was controlling evolution?" "Not controlling," Ethan corrected. "Facilitating, accelerating, guiding. And when we found it, when we brought samples back to study," he exhaled slowly, "that's when everything went to hell." Claire's stomach twisted. "What happened?" Ethan's jaw tensed. "We weren't the only ones looking for it." For the first time, Claire felt something icy slip down her spine. Not just fear, but the realization that whatever Ethan had been involved with, it wasn't just some scientific discovery gone wrong. It was something bigger, something dangerous. "They came for us," Ethan continued, his voice quieter now. "Government, private interests, people who understood what we had found and saw its potential for something else. They didn't want to study it, Claire. They wanted to use it." Claire clenched her fists. "Use it for what?" Ethan met her eyes and she felt the weight of his next words before he even said them. Weaponization. She cursed under her breath, the truth settling over her like a lead blanket. Of course they did. They didn't just want to replicate the process, Ethan said, his voice tight. They wanted to control it, to force evolution in directions that suited their needs. Enhanced soldiers, adaptable bioweapons, even full species modification. He shook his head. I couldn't let that happen. I went dark, destroyed as much of the research as I could, but they still had samples. I thought I had lost them when I disappeared. But then, his gaze flickered toward Noah. Claire followed his eyes, her pulse quickening. Then what? Noah found you. A cold realization settled over her. Wait, you're saying Noah came to me on purpose? Ethan nodded. It was looking for you, just like I was. Her heart pounded. Why? Ethan hesitated, then finally said, because you're the only one left who can stop them. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Claire felt like she was standing on the edge of something vast, something too big to fully grasp. The past 12 hours had shattered everything she thought she knew. Her brother was alive. The rules of evolution weren't what she had believed. And now she was somehow at the center of a conflict that had been set in motion long before she even knew it existed. Her throat felt dry. What do we do? Ethan studied her for a long moment, then turned toward the far end of the tunnel. We keep moving. There's a safe house outside the city, a place where we can regroup. Claire nodded, pushing down the whirlwind of emotions threatening to consume her. She didn't have the luxury of disbelief anymore. The world had already changed. She had seen it with her own eyes. As Ethan moved ahead, she reached down and pressed a gentle hand against Noah's side. The creature's breathing had steadied, its golden eyes flickering open just enough to meet hers. A strange understanding passed between them, something silent but certain. She didn't know what Noah was, not completely, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let anyone take it. She straightened, following Ethan into the darkness, leaving behind the remnants of the past and stepping into the unknown. The night air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and distant rain as Claire followed Ethan through the underground tunnels, her breath steady despite the weight of everything she had learned. Noah moved beside her, its golden eyes sharp despite the exhaustion etched into its strange, shifting form. The distant hum of the city above them was a reminder that normal life was still going on. People sleeping in their beds, oblivious to the fact that evolution itself had become something malleable, something controllable, something that had been twisted into a weapon. She could still hear the voices of the agents in the back of her mind, the cold precision of their orders. Surrender the specimen. That's what they called Noah. Not a being, not a life, but a thing. And Claire had seen enough life slip through her hands in the ER to know that she wasn't about to let it happen again. Ethan led them deeper, past rusted maintenance doors and sections of tunnel that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The light from his handheld scanner flickered against the walls, casting strange, shifting shadows. Almost there, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Claire stayed close, her body coiled with anticipation. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to stay alert, to be ready because she knew they weren't safe yet. Then Ethan stopped. Ahead of them, a heavy steel door blocked their path. Unlike the others they had passed, this one was reinforced, the edges lined with something more advanced than simple locks or keypads. Claire barely had time to question it before Ethan placed his palm against the surface, and the entire panel came to life, scanning his hand with an eerie, silent precision. A low hiss sounded, and then the door slid open, revealing a space beyond that was unlike anything she had expected. The room was vast, dimly lit by rows of overhead panels that pulsed softly, casting everything in shades of cold blue. Consoles lined the walls filled with data streams and energy readings she couldn't begin to understand. And at the center of it all, a massive chamber stood, its glass surface lined with cracks, as if something had forced its way out. But what made her stomach tighten was the shape suspended inside the remaining fluid. A skeletal framework, half-formed, something that looked almost human, but wasn't. A failed experiment. a warning of what could happen if Ethan had failed. "This is where it started," Ethan said quietly, stepping forward. "The first attempt, before Noah." Claire swallowed hard, her mind spinning. "How many?" Ethan didn't answer immediately, but his silence spoke for itself. A sharp mechanical chime broke through the stillness. Claire spun, heart hammering, just as the monitors flickered, their displays distorting before resolving into something that made her blood run cold. A face, or at least the closest thing to one. It was human once, she thought, but whatever was staring back at them now had been changed, refined into something that barely clung to its original form. The skin was too smooth, too artificial, the eyes too reflective, as if they had been built rather than born. Its lips parted and a voice echoed through the space, smooth as glass, sharp as a blade. "Dr. Donovan, Nurse Donovan, you should not have come here." Claire barely had time to register the icy precision of the voice before the room's lighting shifted, emergency alarms flaring to life. Noah let out a low warning growl, its fur bristling as the temperature in the room dropped, and suddenly she knew. They had found them. Ethan's fingers flew across the console. "They're overriding the security. Claire, we need to move." But the voice didn't stop. "You cannot stop what has already begun. Evolution is no longer a matter of time. It is a matter of control, and you are standing in the way of progress." The sound of metal grinding against metal made Claire whip around just in time to see the far wall splitting apart, revealing figures stepping through. Not human, not fully. Their movements were too smooth, too calculated, their limbs bending at angles that weren't natural. They looked like men but moved like machines, their eyes devoid of anything resembling life. Noah reacted first. The creature lunged, its body shifting mid-motion, its limbs elongating, adapting, as if instinct alone was guiding its transformation. It hit the first soldier with enough force to send it crashing backward, but the others didn't hesitate. Claire barely had time to duck as gunfire erupted, the air splitting with the sharp crack of suppressed rounds. Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the other side of the lab, where a reinforced door was starting to seal itself shut. "Go!" he shouted, and she realized too late that he wasn't following. Her heart lurched. "Ethan!" He turned, his expression unreadable. "I have to finish this." The world around her slowed, the sounds fading into something distant, something she couldn't quite reach. She had just found him again. She couldn't lose him. Not again. But Ethan was already moving, his hands flying across the controls, overriding systems she couldn't begin to understand. The floor beneath them shuddered, the entire structure humming with energy, and through the chaos, she realized what he was doing. He was shutting it all down. The research, the facility, everything. The soldiers advanced, their weapons shifting, adapting, but before they could reach him, Noah let out a sound that Claire felt in her bones, something raw and ancient, and filled with the weight of something more than survival. Its body twisted, changed, something rippling beneath its fur. And in an instant, the air around it seemed to distort, bending reality itself. The soldiers faltered, and Ethan hit the final command. The explosion wasn't fire, it wasn't destruction, it was something else. A pulse, a wave of energy that rippled outward, distorting everything it touched. The soldiers collapsed instantly, their bodies seizing before they crumbled like hollow shells. And Claire felt it hit her chest like a force she couldn't define, a pressure that pulled at something deep inside her before letting go. Then there was silence. She gasped, struggling to pull in air, her vision swimming. The facility was collapsing, the walls fracturing, the ceiling buckling. Through the haze, she saw Ethan watching her, his expression calm, resolved. "No," she choked out, realizing he wasn't coming with her. But before she could reach him, Noah was there, pulling her away, its body warm, solid, unrelenting. The last thing she saw was Ethan's face before the doors sealed between them. And then they were running. The tunnels blurred past in a haze of crumbling stone and flickering lights, the weight of everything pressing down on her. But she didn't stop, didn't let herself feel the full weight of what she had lost. Not yet. By the time they surfaced, the city was still, unchanged, oblivious. Claire stood there breathing hard, her hands shaking, the cold wind biting at her skin. Noah was beside her, watching her, waiting. She turned back, half expecting to see Ethan, to see the facility still standing. But there was nothing, just the distant hum of traffic, the glow of streetlights, and the knowledge that the world had changed, even if no one else knew it yet. She exhaled slowly, pressing a hand against Noah's side, feeling the steady, solid rise and fall of its breath. She didn't know what came next, but she knew one thing: this wasn't over.